So this is a walkthrough for Edexcel English Literature Paper 1. It's to prepare you for your mock that you have in February, but as I've written at the bottom here in the blue band at the bottom, at the end of the day, exam technique won't help you very much if you don't know the content. So I've included some links here, or not links, but kind of arrows, I suppose, pointing you in the right direction. So if you have access to YouTube, you can use Mr. Bruff, Mary Meredith for the poetry, Mr. Sales is another good one. GCSE Pod is also very useful, which you have a link through the school for. They're really short, nice, digestible chunks of content for the texts that we cover. And you also have a login for digital theatre for free. And your login name is the same. All the students have the same login. It's cows.dt and your password is theatre. It's all the same, and there's nothing more you could possibly want for Macbeth than what's on that website. You've also been given a revision plan. So what's the revision plan, I hear you ask? That is not just for English, that's for, I believe at this point, it's for all of your core subjects. So English, maths, and science. Although if you're listening to this in the summer term before the actual exam, then you'll have it for all of your subjects. I believe that the advice is 3 to 4 hours a night, but obviously you're going to have to prioritize which subjects you feel you need more support in and use the time that you have on what you need the most. So I've just included a little screenshot here of our first week that I suggested in the English instructions, and that was to start revising Macbeth by going to digital theatre, and we re-watch Act 1 and Act 2 in this session. But there's also, if you don't need to re-watch it or watch it, you can go to GCSE Pod and download the author, historical context, and the acts for Macbeth and revise it that way. It's very unlikely that your teachers are going to have time at this point in year 11 to go through the content in the detail that you did in year 10, and indeed for Macbeth even in year 9. So you're going to have to do this revision, some of the revision at home. So hopefully your English teacher will walk you through how to make notes, how to make effective revision cards, to help you with that process. Okay? And it's going to walk you through the paper. So it's just exam technique, like I said. So this paper is 50% of your literature GCSE. And the video, the slides, there's a lot of them, and it is quite detailed, so it's intense. But I have sectioned it into 3 parts, so you can sit down and look at certain parts of the exam, which I'm going to put in a document and attach to Show My Homework and email. So you'll have the paper. It's a practice paper that we made, and the actual response booklet as well, because we want to just bring your attention to a couple of things with that. So you can do it all in one sitting, or you can do part of it tonight, part of it another night, and part of it another day. That's up to you. So in the meanwhile, what you need to do is stop the PowerPoint and make sure you have the practice paper printed, the extract booklet, and the answer booklet. And you may also want to grab your knowledge organizer, which I've also attached in case you've lost yours, for an inspector calls and for Macbeth, because I refer to them throughout the video as well. And they're a really good resource to help you learn the content and material that we believe will help you the most. There's obviously more to know than what's on those knowledge organizers, but they are a good start for trying to remember key points and information that you need to know and that you can apply to a variety and range of questions. Okay, so grab the stuff that you need, grab a pen and a pencil, sit down and get started. So this will be the first paper that you write for English, and it will also be like that when you do mock papers. The exam is 1 hour and 45 minutes long, and it is worth 50% of your final mark for literature. What is on the exam? So it's Macbeth and an inspector calls. I have a screenshot there of the front of the paper. So it shows you Shakespeare, on the right, Shakespeare and post-1914 literature, which for us is an Inspector Calls. That's the front of the paper 2 years ago. You get an extract booklet, and it's important to know that in the actual exam, the booklet is an actual book. There's lots of extracts in it, not just the ones that we've chosen from Macbeth and an Inspector Calls. So you just have to be aware of that, because there'll be extracts from Romeo and Juliet and Merchant of Venice, which you have not studied, so don't do those questions. Macbeth is always first. So for Macbeth, you are advised to spend 55 minutes on it. So you can see that in red there right on the exam paper. So it's 55 minutes, which means, just over 22 minutes on part A and 22 minutes on part B. Although you may find, for part of it that you can be a bit more fluid with your timings. But your first part is your extract analysis, and that's when you're using C's structure paragraphs to zoom in. And then when you're finished with that, you start on the whole text question, where you zoom out and you do not comment on the extract, which I'll come back to in a second. But basically you have your two parts, and students always want to know, how many paragraphs do I have to write for each section? But of course that's not really how it works. As a guideline, I would say you should probably aim for 3 paragraphs for part A and 3 paragraphs for part B. So that's 6 C's paragraphs in 55 minutes. No, it's not easy, but if you practice, then you'll get there. You have to practice though to get your timings right for this paper. And don't leave any of it blank. Make sure that if you get to the end of 25 minutes for part A, that you move on to part B and leave it. Make sure you attempt every question. So part B, once you're finished that 55 minutes, nobody's going to tell you to stop. You have to keep an eye on the time. So when you're finished that 55 minutes and absolutely no longer than an hour, you go on to an Inspector Calls. No matter what, you stop Macbeth and you move on to an Inspector Calls. And you choose one of 2 questions, only one. So it's a longer essay. There's not special parts or anything for this one. It's just one of 2 questions. You do not have a copy of the book. It's a closed book. You have to know the context. The context is what drives your response for this answer. So you need to know why Priestley wrote it, when he wrote it, and when it was set, and why. And again, you're advised to spend 50 minutes on that section. So for Macbeth Part A, what is the examiner looking for? Well, here's the mark scheme. So it's out of 20. Part A is out of 20 and Part B is out of 20. Generally, people tend to, even without trying, get the same mark on both if they attempt both, which means you have to try for both. Some students think that they just want to aim for a grade 4, and so they think they don't need to put a lot of prep into it. You can't aim for a low mark response for this. It just doesn't work. You have to aim for as high as you can get. So in the mid band here, in level 3, which is not a grade 3, that's just for examiners to know where to kind of place your essay when they're looking at it. So that the levels don't serve any other purpose there on the left hand side. So the content of what you would get for 9 to 12 marks is showing an understanding of a range of language form and structures and linking these to their effect on the reader. And it also means that you use at least some subject terminology. So you're using things like metaphor, noun, words, but that also subject terminology also refers to things like author, play, Shakespeare, things that are actually quite simple for you to remember. So what we're all teaching you to do though, regardless of what class you're in, is you're aiming to analyze. So you're aiming for at least 13 to 16 marks at least. And in order to do that, you have to consistently analyze the language, the form, and the structure of this extract on the reader. So it means, how do you know if you're analyzing? I'm sure that you're aware that when you analyze things, it means that you break it down into its smallest parts. And essentially you're showing you're working out. So you're talking specifically about what things mean in a literal sense, and then you're thinking about how Shakespeare's using those on a deeper level. but you do have to break it down into its smallest parts, which I'm going to walk you through how to do that. So this is a typical extract example. So the first thing you do is you read through the extract really carefully. If you don't understand what the extract is saying, you're not going to be able to analyze it. So all we can do is hope that you have read the play carefully, studied the play carefully, and revised the play carefully. And no, you won't get it your first time. You have to do it and then do it again and do it again. So this is an extract from earlier on in the play when Macbeth is deciding if he's going to, well, he's decided he's going to kill Duncan, and the guilt for doing it and his ambition kind of merge together and make him hallucinate a dagger in front of him. And so he has a soliloquy here, which is a speech that he says without anyone else hearing him. It's just for the audience to get some insight into his mental state. Okay, so the first thing you do is you read the extract really carefully and very slowly. It's worth putting the time in to do that. You have to ignore the things that you don't understand or that might be a bit different, and focus on the images that you do understand. And like I said, hopefully it's a speech or a part of the text that you'll recognize from your studies, so it won't be completely unseen and something you've never dealt with before. So the question's always at the bottom or on the next page, and you can see there's part A and part B, so I've made them bigger over on the right hand side of the page. So part A reads, explore how Shakespeare presents Macbeth in this extract. Part B says, just ignore that other sentence in part A. Part B says, explain the presentation of ambition elsewhere in the play. In your answer, you must consider when and who shows ambition and the consequences of ambition. So what we always tell students is that if you look at part B, it gives you a clue for what to talk about in part A. So if you look in this one, it says explore the presentation of ambition. And it says just above that, which should have been in the part B question, Macbeth shows his ambition. Well, obviously in part A, when it says how does Shakespeare present Macbeth in this extract, you're going to talk about the fact that it shows him as ambitious. The part B is the key, the clue, the hint for how to start part A. So for part B, you can see I have the S, E, I, Z, O, and E. So you're zooming out. And for part A, you're zooming in. So you're looking specifically at the extract. And for part B, you're not. It's elsewhere in the play. How do you know if you're zooming out? When you zoom out on the context. So if you picture you're taking a camera and you're using the zoom feature to get as much of the picture as possible in front of you. So you're thinking about the time when the play was written. So for us, it would be 1605, 1606, and the place, obviously London, but it's set in Scotland. And you can also zoom out on the play as a whole and the development of ideas across the text. You can link in other parts of the play where this particular idea is shown as well, which I'll get more into when we look at how to answer a part B question. So here's the extract that we've chosen to do for a practice paper for you. So Macbeth begins, and I'll read it to you. Hopefully you can follow along. And as I said, don't be put off by the bits that you don't understand. Focus on what you do understand. Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle turned toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation, proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain? I see thee yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw. Palpable means to touch. Thou marshallest me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest. I see thee still, and on thy blade in dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so there before. There's no such thing. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. Now o'er one half-world nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the curtain's sleep. Witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings, and withered murder, alarmed by his sentinel the wolf, whose howls his watch, thus with his stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing strides towards his design moves like a ghost. Thou sure and firm-set earth, hear not my steps, which way they walk, for fear thy very stones prate of my whereabout, and take the present horror from the time which now suits with it. Whiles I threat he lives, words to the heat of deeds too cold breath gives. I go, and it is done. The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell. I'm definitely not Patrick Stewart reading that, but you get the idea, and there's a link on the bottom of this page which brings you to Patrick Stewart reading it in much better tones than I did. So you can check out the scene there, or again on Digital Theatre, which has many different versions, many different actors presenting the same scene. So again, part A says explore how Shakespeare presents Macbeth in this extract, and part B asks, in this extract Macbeth shows his ambition, explain the presentation of ambition elsewhere in the play. In your answer, you must consider when and who shows ambition and the consequences of ambition. And just to repeat, part B, which tells you exactly how Macbeth is presented as showing his ambition, is meant to help you get started on part A. So you can link that into all of your topic sentences, all of your statement sentences can be linked to how he is or is wrestling with his ambition. So the first thing you want to do after you reread the question is divide the extract into 3. I know there's a little bit that I've left out, but that's because this isn't a total analysis of the extract, it's just exam technique. So you divide your page into 3. Now hopefully you're applying that strategy to every aspect of the exams. So in your language exam, you divide the extract into 3. On paper 2 in language, you divide the extract into 3. On a Christmas Carol extract, you divide the text into 3. You can even do that with the unseen poems. It doesn't work so well with the taught poetry because, of course, one of them has to be memorized. So you have to, that would mean that you'd have to know the first line of every poem. So, but it works for absolutely everything else, and it makes it a lot easier to deal with the text. If you think I need something from the beginning, something from the middle, and something from the end to explain how Shakespeare here is showing Macbeth as being ambitious. So do that now on your extract. Before you write your response, if you open up the response booklet or look at it on your screen, this is what it looks like. That's the insert, sorry, but this is the top of section A, and it says Shakespeare at the top. So there's 6 questions because there are 6 different Shakespeare plays that you could have studied. We chose Macbeth because it is the shortest and the most interesting of all 6. Although people debate that, obviously, but it is short. So Macbeth is always question 1, and the reason I'm showing you this is because students so often forget to put their little X in the box, and it just means that their exam goes to a different pile to be marked. So you want to keep everything together, keep it, you know, within your control. So tick question 1 and then move on to try and answer the question. So the first thing you're going to want to do is, once you have read the extract once and you understand it and you've divided it into 3, you go back and you look for language and structural techniques that Shakespeare's used to try and present Macbeth as either ambitious, maybe not ambitious, or wrestling with ambition. And then you want to just start annotating it for that. So is this, I'm not going to do this for every single section, but for this bit, I'll show you and walk you through how I would suggest that you do it. Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still. Art thou not, fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? What he's saying there is he recognizes that the vision is potentially announcing a fatality or about death. But sensible to feeling as to sight is because he's trying to use this sense of touch to touch the dagger. So he's saying, art thou not sensible? Can I not touch you as well as see you? And then he responds to his own question by saying, or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat oppressed brain? I see thee yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw. So palpable means to be able to touch it. So you can touch it, you can feel it. If it's palpable, it means that it's not just an abstract idea. So he kind of recognizes in that section when he says, or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation, he recognizes really that it could be his own heat-oppressed brain that's causing him to see this vision, and that it could indeed not be a real dagger standing in front of him. But he looks again, and he continues at the second last line, I see thee yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw. He's not got out a paper and pencil and is not drawing a dagger, he is taking it out of its sheath. So he's pulling the dagger out and getting ready to use it, presumably. Okay, so once I've done that with my first section, I'm going to think about what I could potentially talk about. Yeah, I could talk about how there's a rhetorical question potentially, or a question, is this a dagger which I see before me? I could mention the alliterative come, let me clutch thee, with that alliterative harsh C sound. There's the personal pronoun I have thee not and see thee still, so this kind of like mirroring. But I'm going to zero in on fatal vision, or potentially where I've underlined dagger of the mind, a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain, because I like that metaphorical language and I therefore can talk a lot about it. So for me, that's what I would call like a juicy piece of evidence, something that I could really talk about the literal meaning of and talk about how Shakespeare's using it here to show Macbeth as ambitious. So obviously I've already said a dagger of the mind, a false creation, something that he's creating. Proceeding means to come from, so it's coming from his heat-oppressed brain. So what would heat-oppressed mean? What's the literal meaning of heat-oppressed? Obviously it means he's warming up, but really I get a sense of pressure from that. He feels pressure in his brain. The word oppressed for me means like a lack of freedom and being restricted or constrained. And so in his brain, who, you know, he was a really brave warrior, he was someone who was loyal, someone who fought well for Duncan. So I can imagine that his brain is heat oppressed, thinking about what he's about to do. So he can't handle the stress, basically, of what he's trying to do. So now I'm going to show you an example paragraph of how I would turn that into an answer. So you will have been taught by your teacher the C's structure. There's lots of different ones. There's petal, there's Peaser, there's PEE, but generally we've found over time that C's is the most effective of all of them. So that's why we're evolving and changing the way that we teach how to respond. So for this particular question, you will want to zoom in, right? So I talked about heat oppressed, I talked about fatal vision, and I know that this is in some way going to show a little bit about Macbeth's ambition. And I just wanted to point this triangle out to you because if you look at the C's structure and you look at the numbers along the left-hand side, you get a sense of when each letter is completed in a paragraph, you get a kind of sense for what grade you're working at. So if you simply make a statement and that the statement is correct, so you are answering the question and you're talking about the author's purpose correctly, and you bring in evidence which is also embedded in a sentence that makes grammatical sense. And you're starting to infer what that could potentially mean. You're kind of, what we used to say is called explaining. But when you're kind of inferring, oh, it could mean this, it could mean that, this is what the author's trying to do, you're kind of working at about a borderline grade 3-4 level. And you can see where it says zoom in, and you scale across there, and you can see it's in between a 5 and a 6. And that's why we keep going on and on and on at you to zoom in. So you really have to take a microscopic, what do you call it? A microscope, and really look in detail at how those words and phrases are used. So here is my model paragraph for you. It could have been better, but it could also be worse. And it generally just shows you how to lay out a paragraph using the C's structure. So I start with the statement, you can see the S on the left-hand side, and the statement is always linked back to the question. So this is about how is Macbeth presented, and part B kind of told me I should talk about ambition, so I'm going to talk about that in my statement as well. So my response starts with Shakespeare shows Macbeth's character developing into a man who is so caught up in his growing ambition that he's hallucinating and wrestling with his decision to murder Duncan. He begins by calling the image of the dagger a fatal vision and a false creation of the heat-oppressed brain. So your quotations have to be embedded into a sentence that makes grammatical sense. You don't want to just smack fatal vision in quotes just there on its own, which some students do tend to try and do at the grade 2 level. And you really need to make sure that you show, when you put your evidence into a sentence, that you know where it comes from. So I'm saying, well, he begins by calling the image of the dagger a fatal vision. If you were to write, he says fatal vision, you're not showing me that you understand what he's actually talking about or what he is calling a fatal vision. So you have to be a bit more specific than that. So he begins by calling the image of the dagger a fatal vision and a false creation of the heat-oppressed brain. Now in the inference bit, this is where you just explain on a general level, what do those two bits of quotations mean? What's he getting at here when he says that the vision is fatal and that it's a false creation? And this is what I've written. He seems to know that this vision is a sign that something is not quite right with him. His decision to betray his king is no doubt weighing, it should say, heavily on his mind, and Shakespeare seems to suggest that Macbeth isn't sure if he really sees the knife, or if the vision is the result of the stress that he's under. And I mean, you could have said all sorts of different things in that section. And the main thing to remember is to use modal verbs. Shakespeare seems to, Shakespeare might be, Shakespeare could be showing, because you want this response to be exploratory, and ultimately you want to see if you can suggest perhaps multiple meanings here. So you could say that he says it's a false creation, so it could be that he's really stressed and he knows he could be making it up, but also it could be saying that he believes the fatal vision is actually talking about his own death eventually in the play. So you can talk about what you think it means in that section. So this next bit, fatal vision, if you see the eye, and you see specifically, if you look at just the shape of the rectangle that I've written the answer in, and you see how much space it takes up, that's basically the point here. And that's that you're zooming in on things because you're going into the detail of what's said and what it means and the effect of what it means. It takes up a lot of space physically on the page when you're doing it. So you kind of know you're on the right track if you're taking, your paragraphs are quite long. So here I've zoomed in. His reference to the fatal vision shows that he understands that this vision might be just that, a dream-like image that he can see that is fatal, which means he believes the dagger is announcing the murder of Duncan. Fatal implies that something will cause death or disaster. Now you'll notice that saying that fatal causes death or disaster or is death or disaster is the literal meaning of fatal. And that's where your analysis is always going to start, is at the level where you're talking about its literal meaning. So continuing reading, it's almost as though the decision to kill Duncan is taken out of Macbeth's hands, and the dagger is some sort of sign of the inevitability of fatality to come. Macbeth knows the vision might not be real when he continues to suggest that his own mind created it, because his brain is heat oppressed. The idea that his mind is under heat could suggest pressure, and that this heat is oppressive. Again emphasizes that Macbeth may feel a lack of freedom. His decision at this point makes him feel uncomfortable. And then finally you end by thinking about what the audience would make of all of this. The audience would see Macbeth is beginning to descend, it should say, from being a brave and worthy thane to the inevitable dead butcher he becomes. You do not talk about context in part A. It's just the words, the phrases, where they are on the page, the punctuation, just what you can see in front of you. You may refer to parts of the play to explain how your interpretation has developed, but you don't start talking about King James I. You don't start talking about witches and the contextual information. It's what we call a forensic analysis. So you're looking just at the evidence in front of you, nothing else. So after Macbeth decides whether or not the vision is real, or thinks about whether it's real or not, he begins with saying, "Thou marshallest me the way I was going, and such an instrument I was to use." So just to clarify here, marshallest, if you think about a race marshal, it means to show the way. So being marshal means to lead or arrange in order. And a dudgeon, which is a funny word, dudgeon, means the wooden handle of a dagger. So hopefully in your extract, a couple of the words anyway should be explained. And I'm not doing a fully developed essay, but I will just go through one more example paragraph with you talking about structure, because students find it really difficult to write about structure competently and fluidly, and that's when their responses start to fall apart. And this technique applies also to your language exam, both paper 1 and paper 2, whenever you're asked about language and structure. It applies to the poetry when you're talking about caesura, enjambment, or punctuation. It applies to structure in any capacity in your English GCSE. So if you go to the middle bit where I've underlined "there's no such thing," I'll read the whole thing just so that it makes sense. "So thou marshallest me the way I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Mine eyes are made the fools of the other senses, or else worth all the rest. I see thee still, and on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before. There's no such thing. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. Now all o'er the one half-world nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep. Witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings, and Hecate, or Hecate as she's also known as the queen of witches, and withered murder, alarmed by his sentinel the wolf, whose howls his watch, thus with his stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing strides towards his design, moves like a ghost." Now, depending on the grade that you're aiming for, if you were trying to go for a 7 or an 8, you may refer to the illusion of Tarquin, who was a Roman emperor known for rape and murder, and so that's why he's described as having ravishing strides. So it's really quite worrying and a bit gross that Macbeth is sort of seeing himself as this person. You could talk about how murder is personified with his sentinel, a wolf, and so forth, but I'm going to go for the much more straightforward "there's no such thing, it is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes." So on the next slide I'll show you a paragraph which zeroes in on a structural technique. So just to clarify, for Part A, you should aim to write 3 C's paragraphs. But for grade 7, you must make sure that you talk about language and structure together and evaluate how each enhances the other. So perhaps we'll have time before the actual exam to make another video for that. This is aiming for 5. So in the middle of the extract, Macbeth is absolutely certain there is no dagger in front of him and that it is his ambition to kill Duncan that is making him see things. So if this were my second paragraph in my response, you can see that my statement again uses the word ambition. It doesn't matter if it's repetitive, it's supposed to be repetitive because you're answering one question. So it's supposed to keep referencing the question. So he's absolutely certain there's no dagger, he's seeing it, and it's his ambition that's making him do so. So my evidence for this is that he says that the dagger marshalleth him the way. But then, in an abrupt and jarring short sentence, it should say abrupt and jarring short sentence, he boldly claims there's no such thing, it is the bloody business that is making him see things. So my inference is that Shakespeare could be showing Macbeth as unsure of himself because he's supposed to be a brave and loyal soldier. So it's likely this act of treason is making him unravel mentally with guilt and ambition at odds with each other. He could also be giving up responsibility for his decision by saying that the dagger is leading him to do the deed and therefore it's not his and never was his decision to make. It's been done for him. So there we get 2 inferences. So that in and of itself would start working towards the grade 4-5 borderline. And here's where the money is for your marks. So in this section, in the Z section or Z section, it should say zoom in, so ZI. It's about the extract, so I'm zooming in on what the words mean. So to marshal means to guide or direct, which means that Macbeth, in a sense, is letting go of responsibility for killing Duncan by suggesting the dagger is leading him to do it. The short sentence, there is no such thing, shows Macbeth has finally made up his mind and is resolved to commit treason. The use of the verb is within this short command sentence emphasizes his determination. It is. There is no such thing. And then here you'll notice I've actually put a colon in quotation marks. The use of the colon introduces what he believes really is happening, and that he is not seeing a dagger, but that it is his mind projecting the image because his brain is focused on the bloody business. So I'm actually saying, here's a colon, this is what the colon is introducing, and that's why I'm able to get a higher level mark there for that structural technique of the colon. You can't just say, there's some short sentences which show he is determined. You're clearly not going to get a good mark for that. You have to be a lot more forensic or a lot more specific about it. So in this short this short sentence, there's no such thing, shows his determination, specifically because of the word is, but also there's a colon, and the colon is introducing. Whether or not that colon was there when Shakespeare originally wrote the play, we'll never know because punctuation has changed over time, but it is in our version, so we talk about it. And then my response continues with this bloody business is, of course, the murder of Duncan. He could also be referring to the literal idea of blood due to the act of stabbing, but also he could be considering the blood as a symbol for the evil of the act he's about to commit. He calls it business, which implies he's starting to see Duncan as not a human but a transaction or job that must be done, and shows a complete lack of sympathy. The audience will see Macbeth's loss of reality and lose any sympathy they may have once had for him. When you're talking about that last bit, the effect on the audience, you don't need to go on and on and on about it. One short little sentence is enough, because when you're talking about the effect of the language, you are, in a sense, already talking about the effect on the audience, because it's how the audience understands what's going on. So you don't have to keep saying the audience, the audience, the audience over and over and over again in this, because the mark scheme includes audience for this in the bullet point, which is actually about analyzing the language, the effect of the language and structure used. So once you finish with your part A, and you're not going to get, you might not get to 3 C's paragraphs the first time this year that you attempt a Part A in timed conditions, but the only way to get there is through practice. You have to keep practicing, and it has to become very robotic and very natural, like second nature to you. So once you're finished with that 22 minutes, you move on to the next one. And that's when you start looking at Part B. So Part A was all about Macbeth and the presentation of Macbeth, and Part B is about how ambition is presented elsewhere in the play. And one of the biggest traps that students fall into is they begin this response looking at the extract, and you can't do that. So the first thing you have to do is cross it out, because you can't use it. You can't use that material. Not at all. I wouldn't even refer to it in your interpretations. I just wouldn't, because you don't get any marks for it. So it has to be something else in the play. So for zooming out, if you look in the bottom corner here on the right hand side, you can zoom out on the context, which is the time and the place, or you can zoom out on the play as a whole and look at the development of ideas across the text. So for example, if I say Lady Macbeth shows herself as ambitious in the scene where she says, "Come you murdering ministers that tend on mortal thoughts," and all of that, "unsex me here," that famous scene, and I'm saying, oh, she's really ambitious in that scene, and she's willing to do all sorts of crazy things to be showing her ambition. But I might want to zoom out and say, this is true. However, this ambition does end up being her downfall, as we later know. She ends up sleepwalking. She ends up going a little bit crazy. She ends up returning to an infantile state, and ultimately she kills herself. So that's where you might be zooming out on those connections to develop your ideas further. So in Macbeth Part B, what is the examiner looking for? You're probably going to guess that I'm going to say you can't aim for this. You need to aim higher. So we're aiming for at least a mark of 13 or higher for this. There's basically 4 things that you need to do. You have to show thorough engagement and well-chosen references. And there is no way to do that if you don't know the play. You have to, for Part B in particular, you have to know the play inside and out. And the only way to do that probably at this point is to do your revision. You have to show a well-developed interpretation, which is the inferential part of your C's paragraph. So that's where you're talking about what things mean and why. And you have to show the last 2 sections, the last 2 bullet points, number 3 and number 4, on the right-hand side, show that you have to show that you understand the context. So the conditions of life that produced the play, and you have to talk about how those conditions influence your interpretation of what happens in the play. So, for example, if you're going to talk back about Lady Macbeth, and you're going to say about the scene where she says, "Unsex me here," you got to pay homage to or mention the fact that in 1605 women had very different roles than they do today. And so for a woman at that time in particular, because of the way women were seen as either mothers or as, well, basically they were seen as either mothers and wives or fallen women. Because of that restriction on their identity, it was very bold indeed for Lady Macbeth to be talking about stopping up the passage to remorse. So of her taking on any kind of masculinity or masculine role and completely getting rid of her femininity. And in particular, the bit where she says that if she had a newborn baby, that she would rather have dashed out the brains of the child rather than to go back on her promise. If she had promised to kill Duncan, we know that because of the Jacobean view of women in particular, that would have been horrific in the eyes of the audience. So you're talking about how what life was like in 1605 may influence your understanding of what Shakespeare's purpose is. So this is just a screenshot before we begin planning this response. I just wanted to point out the fact that you have been given, hopefully in class, a knowledge organizer for Macbeth, for an Inspector Calls, and for A Christmas Carol, and potentially even the poetry. And on each of those is about 18 to 20 quotations. We've not given you those just because they're interesting. We've given them to you because we've chosen them as quotations that can be used in a variety of different responses. So the more that you know them, and the more time you spend learning them, it's not really for the point of memorizing the quote, because you don't have to get it picture perfect for this for part B. It's more just the content of what the quotes are talking about. So it's because you have to make references to different parts of the play. So we've chosen a variety of quotations that we feel are really helpful in a variety of circumstances and for a variety of questions. So grab that, look at it, print out a color copy if you can at home, or bring your copy from home. Hopefully you've been given two. You should have been given a black and white one for home and a color one to keep in school, but it doesn't really matter. You can print out a color one at home, take some blue tack or tape and stick it up in your room and learn these quotations. And learn who says them and to whom. If you can't do that with a friend or at school with your teacher, you can look them up really easily. It's very easy to find out who says what. All you have to do is basically cut and paste and put it into Google, or just Google search the quotations and it will tell you. Okay? And then on the right, you've got Shakespeare's time in red, James the First, Divine Right of Kings, The Role of Women, Witches in the Supernatural, Healthcare and Medicine. And those are just the basics of the context that you should know for this play. The stuff that we know is really important. There's a lot more to it, of course, but for GCSE purposes, this would be enough to really help you make sure that you get your target grade in the course. So you need to use it, though, for that to happen. It can't be bunched up in a ball under your bed. It can't be left in your folder at school. It should be something that you speak about confidently and that you have and that you know and you've used to help yourself with your homework and to revise from. I've even seen year 10s, whom we have given these to this year, sat at the dinner tables making revision cards out of quotation for quotations using these. So do use them. They're there to help you. Okay? So they're quotes that you should be learning that can help with this question. Next, I'm going to show you how to plan a response. So the question is, explain the presentation of ambition elsewhere in the play. So personally, I teach planning for every text and every question in exactly the same way. So you should be able to apply the same strategy to every single question. So it'll tell you what you have to think about. Unsurprisingly, you have to think about when and who shows ambition and the consequences of that ambition. So usually I suggest writing do plan, don't try and do it without planning. So if you write ambition in the middle of a circle, you can do this right in your exam booklet right before you answer question B. I would suggest, particularly when you're just getting used to this, that you are planning. And again, just like with the extract, you're thinking about the beginning, the middle, and the end. For the whole text question, you want to be thinking about the beginning, the middle, and the end of the play. So that's a really good way in. You also want to be thinking about key vocabulary that you'll need for this. So it would be very difficult to answer a question without talking about equivocation for any topic to do with Macbeth, because the whole premise of the play is built upon the concept of equivocation, which is when you pretend to be something that you're not, or you say things that you don't mean. It means that you are deliberately lying to cover up the truth. So you'll also be talking about connotation or connotes or connoting. So that's when you talk about a non-literal meaning for something. Treason will probably play a part in any response to do with Macbeth. So the act of going against one's government or one's king at the time. And patriarchy or patriarchal is a society where men are valued more than women, which was definitely the case in 1605. And consequences is an important word to know, because clearly Shakespeare is showing us a play where ambition is the catalyst which causes dire consequences for those that take it too seriously. So the ambition of Macbeth leads to his downfall. The ambition of Lady Macbeth leads to her downfall. No one in the play who is deeply ambitious over and above their kind of natural station in life leads a happy life or has a happy ending. It always leads to death. So consequences is an important word to be able to use confidently in a grade 5 or higher response. So basically, if the question is about ambition, whatever the question is about, you're thinking about the beginning, the middle, and the end, some key vocabulary that you want to remember, and then you must always make quite a big deal about thinking about the author's purpose. So you should be doing this with an inspector calls in part B of this exam. You should be thinking about it with A Christmas Carol and with the poetry. Whatever piece of work you're looking at, you have to think about why the author wrote it. So what key messages is Shakespeare trying to convey? Well, he is trying to entertain. It is a play. It starts with, like all good plays, start with, sex or violence or something that's going to engage the audience. So this one in particular starts with blood. And the unseeming Macbeth is unseeming, someone from the knave to the chop. So it starts with violence, like so many stories, even today. In the big screen in the cinema, they start with violence. He also wants to make sure he doesn't offend royalty. And so the play ultimately shows what happens, the consequences of regicide or the consequences of treason. So basically what I like to say is this play is a love letter to James I. Not a literal love letter, but it is a play that's written with the king in mind. He was a new king, newish. He was not well liked for a long time, and there were several plots, as there often were at the time, to either get him removed or to just assassinate him completely. One of those being the gunpowder plot, which is probably the most famous. Remember the 5th of November. Okay, so Shakespeare, at the time, the royal family would have had a lot of influence. They could have shut the theaters down. Many people did. Religious groups wanted the theaters shut down. It was very, very important for Shakespeare to have King James's support and his followers' support to keep the theaters open so he could not offend them. Okay? So once you've thought about that and you think, okay, well, it doesn't matter what the question is about, because ultimately this is Shakespeare's purpose. This is why he wrote the play, to show the consequences of regicide. He's also showing that ambition is a corroding or corrupting force, which I could have added as another bullet there for the author's purpose. And then quite generally, again, you want to aim for 3 C's paragraphs. So you want to think about the beginning, the middle, and the end. And again, I've said this before, but if you don't know the play well, this question is going to be very difficult for you. You have to know it very well. It's 25% of your GCSE after all, so you want to make sure that you know what happens, who's who, and the general plot of the play. So in the beginning, I've chosen to focus on the line, which you'll notice in your knowledge organisers, where Macbeth says, "Stars, hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires." And he says that right after he finds out that Malcolm's been named the heir, before he sees Lady Macbeth, before he goes back to his castle, and he's kind of got this idea from the witches that he could be king, but then realizes that Malcolm's been named the heir. So he doesn't say it, but the audience kind of gets the idea that he's starting to think about being a king. And of course, nobody can know about that. The stars have to go out. He doesn't want any light shining on this because he's probably feeling shame, because it's very likely that he would know that people would not support his idea, that it would be a very black and deep desire to want to be king when there already is a king. So I've decided to use that because I know I can talk a lot about what I infer the meaning to be for that passage and how it relates to ambition. I would also, in the middle, I thought a good part to look at would be where Lady Macbeth says to her husband, right after the murdering of Duncan, "My hands are of your color, but I shame to wear a heart so white." Now she's already washed her hands at this bit. She's already washed the daggers off on the guards. So my question would be, well, why does she say that I shame to wear a heart so white? What is implied by the use of this color. And when she says, my hands are of your color, she's clearly talking about the blood that Macbeth has on his hands. And also she says, I shame to wear a heart so white. So I would consider the use of the word shame as quite significant. And again, how does that link to context? Well, she's expected as a woman to be a support to her husband. She's not supposed to be leading him down a path to regicide. And it is a patriarchal society. So her here taking charge and saying, look, I'm guilty. I'm just as guilty as you. We're in this together, but I feel like my heart is white. I don't feel I feel shamed, but I don't feel guilty for what I've done. This is pure. My intentions are pure. Is going against what Jacobean society would have expected of a woman. And then finally, I would think you could mention any number of things that happen in the play, but I focused on when Macbeth says, why should I play the Roman fool and die upon my sword? Then later on he says, I'll not yield to kiss the ground below young Malcolm's feet, which I feel shows that he's very proud still and very ambitious. And he doesn't want to, he's not going to fold his cards, so to speak. He's not going to give in. And he doesn't want to kiss the ground below young Malcolm's feet, which to me means he doesn't want to take on a position of subjugation or passivity or being like a slave or submissive pose to Malcolm. So basically, just to review here, so the planning for this, it looks a lot more complicated than it is. If you think about it and you know the play really well, and you will have studied in advance how Shakespeare shows ambition, because you're looking, then you can easily think of 3 different parts of the play. You might change your mind halfway through. You might start thinking, oh no, I didn't think of this or I didn't think of that. But really, you need to get going. You only have 22 minutes to answer 3 paragraphs, write 3 paragraphs. So you really need to get a move on. So you want a quick plan where you just sort of think in advance, okay, there's this part of the play, stars hide your fires, my hands are of your color, and why should I play the Roman fool? There you go. 3 ways ambition is told. But you could have talked about when he goes to see the apparitions and he makes the decision to kill Macduff and his children, and he even says he will surprise his castle and put under the sword all his babes and his children and his servants and everyone. You could talk about the scene where he says, oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife, because he's decided he's going to kill his best BFF, Banquo. You could talk about how ambition makes him see the ghost of Banquo, because ultimately ambition is what made him kill Banquo in the first place. So anything basically from the play that you can make work is something that you can talk about. So you just have to find something from the beginning, something from the middle, and something from the end. So for this section, because you don't need to focus on, like you do with Part A, language and structure, I just have one example paragraph to go through. So for this one, you'll notice that the 4th line down is ZO, so zooming out instead of zooming in. So you're zooming out on the context of the play or another part of the play, which is similar. So in the play, Shakespeare presents ambition as a corrupting force that is the key factor in the catastrophic descent of Macbeth, the once brave and worthy Thane, into a hellhound and dead butcher. Deep down, Macbeth knows that even the idea to be king, while King Duncan is alive, is one of the worst things he could possibly consider. This is obvious when he asks even the stars to hide their fire so light will not see his black and deep desires, even before he goes back to his wife with news of Duncan's arrival. Shakespeare shows that Macbeth begins the play with moral integrity, but that this integrity quickly begins to unravel after the witches sow the seeds of potential kingship in his mind. This could also hint at Macbeth's shame at his growing ambition, as he even wants the stars to stop shining so he's in complete darkness and he can hide his treasonous thoughts. He also describes his desires as black and deep, suggesting he realizes his ambition is evil and corrupting force. So zooming out here on the context, ambition as a corrupting force would have been a popular theme during the time when Shakespeare wrote and produced the play, as the public would have had fresh memories of the Gunpowder Plot, a plot to assassinate King James I. It's ironic that Macbeth begins the play unseaming the traitor MacDonwald, whom Duncan says he trusted, as in the end it's Macbeth that ends up also betraying Duncan and everyone else. So there is a parallel there, or an anti-parallel maybe, where Macbeth starts the play basically killing the traitor and then ends up the traitor by the end. And then the effect on the audience is arguably regicide would have been the ultimate sin, the ultimate of sins in 1605. So the audience would have been quite excited and frightened by Macbeth's call to the stars to hide his desire to become king, and might have also felt deeply troubled as they would have seen the consequences for those involved in the gunpowder plot, which of course involved being hung, drawn, and quartered, and all sorts. So using a seized paragraph, zooming out on the context and the rest of the play. So again, after 55 minutes, which I mentioned earlier on in this slideshow, you have to manage your time yourself. So after 55 minutes, you need to stop and you need to move on to an inspector calls. And for this, it's always going to be questions 7 or 8, not both. Just do one or the other, and it's always 7 or 8. And the reason you need to know that is because in the actual exam booklet, there are another bunch of plays and books that we could have studied. So all of the questions for those are in there as well. So they will be questions 1 to 6, and then 9 and so forth. So you just find question 7, find question 8, and then you choose between the two. You're advised to spend 50 minutes on this section, so not even a full hour. Again, you pick one or the other. So you always get 2 choices, and one is usually a character-based question, and the other will usually be a thematic question. So in this particular one, you get to choose either number 7, I've done nothing I'm ashamed of, or that won't bear investigation, by Mrs. Sybil Burling. In what ways is Mrs. Burling important in the play? You must refer to the context in your answer. Or number 8, we are all members of one body, we are responsible for each other. It's Inspector Gould who says that. And the actual question is, explore the significance of responsibility in an inspector calls. You must refer to the context in your answer. Context is what drives your answer for this question. So it's really important that you do it. There are a number of contextual revision videos that I've suggested in your revision packs. So, and then there's also, loads on the internet that you can find about that if it's something that you struggle with. Again, in the response booklet, so look at all of those choices, and you'll know that you can choose between 7 or 8, not the rest of them. So that's why there is those boxes there. You just tick the one that you answer. Do not leave it blank. And also, the other thing to remember, if you look at the top of the white block where it says Section B, post-1914 literature, that's about halfway through the answer booklet. So you don't answer Shakespeare Part A, Part B, and then an inspector call straight away. You've got to flip a few pages through to the middle of the booklet to be able to write your answer in the right place. If you write it in the wrong place, it may not get marked, and you may end up with a 0 for that question. Okay, so it's important that you do everything properly like you're supposed to. So tick the question 7 or 8, whichever one you're picking, and then also make sure that you're answering in the right place. So what is the examiner looking for? Again, you cannot aim for a level 3 mark. You want to try and get as high as possible, always. Always aim higher, because in the end your mark will be a combination of all of the raw score points that you get throughout the 2 papers. So you just want to make sure that each one is as high as it possibly can be. So we're aiming for level 4 there between 20 and 26 marks, which means it has to be sustained interpretation all the way through. Okay, so if you look in the bottom right hand corner there, remember the play was written in 1945 and performed in 1945. It was first performed in Russia, which may be relevant, but also it was set in 1912, and so you have to understand or show an understanding of why that is significant. Okay, and you'll notice, if you noticed, this is essentially the same mark scheme as Part B on Macbeth. It's almost exactly the same. So you have to talk about references to the text because it's closed book again, so you don't have it in front of you. You have to interpret or infer why certain things have been done and what they mean. And then the last two, number 3 and number 4, are both about the context again. So you have to know why Priestley wrote the play, when he wrote it, and when it was set. Okay, because there's a lot to be said about that for an Inspector Calls. So again, you have the knowledge organizer for an Inspector Calls, just like you have for Macbeth. So you can see here is it's about 20 quotations, I think, that we've chosen. And again, these are quotations. It's not so much the memorizing that's important. It's the idea that you know these quotations really well, and you can reference them in a variety of different questions. So these would help you a lot. You should make some revision cards for them and try and quiz yourself and your friends. And then over on the right hand side you can see the context notes, and that's some of what we feel is relevant for talking about an Inspector Calls. So, and then on the back of the knowledge organizer is just a summary of the play and character quotations. So it just helps you revise, and I would highly suggest that you use these tools. So again, it's really important that you plan for this question. You've got 50 minutes to answer it, 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes spent thinking about what direction you want to take with it and what exactly you want to say is well worth it. So your teachers may be looking for planning when they mark your assessments or your mocks. So how do you plan? So there's two different styles of questions. There's thematic questions and character questions. And generally, you would probably plan each one differently, we would say. So if you're doing a thematic question, then it's likely you'll want to go through each character. So perhaps start with Burling, Sheila, Gerald, Mrs. Burling, and Eric, and go through how each one of those characters in detail used and abused Eva Smith or exploited Eva Smith, and how that pertains to the question. But for a character question, that's different. So you're just focusing on that one particular character and their interactions and relationships with other people throughout the play. So if we took the one from this mock paper or this practice mock paper, it's on the importance of Mrs. Burling, as you saw earlier. So we're going to start thinking about that. But first, always, just like with Macbeth's whole text question, you think about Priestley's purpose. So you have to think about what his key messages are through this play and what exactly he was trying to accomplish by writing it. So we know that he wanted social reform. He wanted Great Britain to change and not to go back to the Edwardian blatant inequality. He wanted the wealthy to recognize the role of the wealthy, their own role, in their responsibility towards the poor. And some of you may call this a didactic message. And a didactic message is when we are being taught something. We're being told certain things that hopefully the author thinks are going to influence the way that we think or the way that we feel about a situation. So some key words that you probably could not write this essay without would be socialism, because Priestley had the inspector be his mouthpiece for socialism, so for more social equality. Capitalism is represented by Mr. Burling in particular and Gerald. So the idea that money is, the most important thing. Exploitation. So the idea of a character being used. To exploit something means to use it. Reform, which means change. Edwardian era, so the king at the time in 1912 was King Edward. Conditions is a good word to use because you'll want to talk about the conditions, the living standards of the different classes in society. Like Shakespeare's day, this was very much a patriarchal society, and in particular Sheila and Mrs. Burling would have been very aware of that. Hierarchy, and a hierarchy means like status. So a hierarchy would have higher status and lower status characters. And one of the things that Priestley uses very effectively in this play is the use of dramatic irony. And that is when we know something as the audience that the characters don't. So it's really important that you understand and use that word in pretty much any essay you write on an inspector calls. So once you have figured that out and you give a little bit of thought to, okay, yes, we understand Priestley wanted social reform, here's some words that I'll probably want to use in my essay, then you start thinking about the beginning, the middle, and the end, like you did for Macbeth's whole text question. So a little bit more detail for this one, if you look in the black box, you want to plan for before the inspector arrives. Think about their family relationships, if it's a character in an inspector calls. How they use their wealth and influence to exploit Eva Smith, and then most importantly, does the character change by the end of the play? These are the 4 considerations. So yes, you're looking at the beginning, the middle, and the end, but in the middle, if you can, you want to think about, how the character treats other people and how they are treated by other people in the family, and also consider how this person has used their wealth and influence in a negative way. Okay, so if we start with the first one, then you may have thought of the fact that in the stage directions, Mrs. Burling is referred to as her husband's social superior. It is the Edwardian era, and you want to think about the contextual information about this. So if she's her husband's social superior, it means that she was born into money, much more money than he had. So you want to think about the fact that also, when you're zooming out on that part, you might want to think about the fact that in the dinner, he tries to give a compliment to the cook and she tells him off for that. She says, oh, you're not supposed to say such things. So she very much sees her role as somebody who looks out for her family and makes sure that they behave in a way that is socially acceptable. She also tells Sheila that when she's a married woman, Sheila will learn to accept that men have important things to do. So Mrs. Burling is very aware of her role in society, and she presents herself in such a way that it establishes her place in the family hierarchy. So family relationships, she's blatantly unaware of the behavior of her own children. She doesn't understand that Eric is an alcoholic. Priestley uses dramatic irony effectively for this because, of course, the audience is aware that he drinks, and the audience is aware that he is the father of Eva's baby, not Sheila's, but she's not. So she knows, we know, and she doesn't. So it's dramatic irony, and she also tells Sheila, oh, someday you'll understand. Because, of course, she's very aware of her place in the patriarchal order, and so that is something that you could talk about as well from the middle or beginning middle of the play. Her treatment of Eva Smith is blatantly probably the worst, some would argue. She says that she's done nothing that she's ashamed of. She refused Eva Smith money, despite the fact that Eva Smith was starving and despite the fact that she knew that Eva was pregnant. Mrs. Burling was the chairperson for the Brumley Women's Charity Association. So at the time, contextually, what influences our interpretation of that might be the fact that we know that over 8 million people were working for less than 25 shillings a week, and that working conditions were extremely difficult for the poor. And also that Eva Smith, if she was pregnant, in particular, how was she going to make money if she had the baby? So she was in desperate need of money, but the fact that she had used Mrs. Burling's name at the start of her request for money really offended Mrs. Burling, and so she decides that she's not ashamed, she's not going to give her help, she's not going to give her money. She also doesn't believe that Eva Smith wouldn't take stolen money, because she essentially believes that poor people are criminals. So that's an idea that I could also develop from the middle towards the end of the play. And then finally, does Mrs. Burling change after Priestley shares his didactic message and after she learns about the fact that her son has lost a child and someone he cared about somewhat? No, she doesn't change. And Sheila says to her, which is a quote from your knowledge organizer, "You're beginning to pretend all over again." So Mrs. Burling has not learned any of the lessons that she was supposed to. And in fact, the inspector does say that if you don't learn your lesson, you will learn it in fire and blood and anguish. So people who had just come through the war would have really taken that to heart. They certainly would not have wanted war again. And if you've been taught about it, you might want to talk about Uzupensky's theory that all life is cyclical and repeats itself until a positive change is made, which is basically just the idea that Priestley kind of believed in multiple dimensions and believed that this idea that on some level life just keeps going and is repeated and repeated until positive decisions are made so that life can go on in a positive way. But generally, all you need to talk about in that paragraph is this idea that Mrs. Burling does not change. And the bell ringing at the end of the play signifies the fact that she didn't learn her lesson and now she's going to have to. She's going to be forced to, because the cycle is going to repeat itself until she changes. So if you just take another clockwise look, starting at Priestley's purpose, at this plan, you begin with the idea that you understand why he wrote the play and what he's wanting to influence in our way of thinking. You think about some of the words that you may want to use. Now, this could be in your head. You might not want to write these out, but you should know them now. And if you don't, I would take the time to think about that. And then you think about the beginning, the middle, and the end. But of course, where this is one question, so if you think for Macbeth, he wrote 6 C's paragraphs. For this one, you want to get at least 4. So you don't bother with an introduction or a conclusion, just go straight into your analytical writing where you are interpreting the fact that she is her husband's social superior, and that's how we meet her at the beginning of the play. So each of those arrows points to 4 different ideas that follow the cycle of the character's presentation throughout the play. So you could do that with Gerald, you could do that with Eric. If you think about how he's presented at the start of the play, it says he's half assertive, half shy, which is obviously a paradox. Okay, so that's one way of tackling the planning before you start your answer. And if you are able to do this, you'll find that your writing is a lot smoother and you don't waste as much time. It doesn't need to be as detailed as I've done just there, but you do need some idea for the specific points in the play that you're going to talk about. And just like with the Macbeth whole text question, if you don't know the play very well, this is going to be pretty difficult. So you need to know that play. And Digital Theatre has this play, so you can watch it anytime you want at home. You can probably borrow a book from the English department to reread it, and you can also check out click revision videos on YouTube to revise it in your own time. Okay, so here's my first paragraph using the C's method, and you'll notice in the 4th box down it said O because I'm zooming out on context, and this would be about a grade 5 paragraph. So right from the beginning, it's clear that Priestley is using Mrs. Burling to represent the typical Edwardian upper-class woman who refuses to accept responsibility to those less fortunate than her. In the stage directions, Priestley portrays her as a rather cold woman and her husband's social superior. We quickly see this truth when she reprimands her husband for telling cook that dinner was top-notch. And then in my inference, Priestley likely wants to portray Sybil Burling as belonging to the old Edwardian order, and to reflect the intense hierarchy of the day and how ingrained in society it was, with its rules of who was worthwhile and who was not. Mrs. Burling would have seen herself as very much superior, higher in rank, to anyone who didn't have money or social status. Priestley's revelation that she is cold could show that she is emotionally detached from those around her, and probably lacks the compassion and warmth that might have saved Eva Smith and her baby's life. It was especially true prior to the First World War, when the play was set in 1912, that society was divided between those who had money and status and those that did not. The wars had changed this, and in 1945, when the play was first performed, Priestley was just sacked from the BBC for his controversial views, some of which included his obvious thoughts on the flaws of capitalism, as ignoring the other members of the body of society that we belong to and should show warmth and compassion to. Priestley wants the audience to immediately sense Mrs. Burling's feelings of superiority and begin to dislike her so that he can push his ideas of socialism as the answer to the callousness of the rich. So you'd be looking to write about 4 of those, so at least 3 from the beginning, the middle, and the end, but you want to be talking about how the character is presented in the stage directions and in that initial part before the inspector arrives. You want to talk about their family interactions, how they treat others and how they are treated by others. You want to talk about how they used and abused their power and authority to exploit Eva Smith, which ultimately leads to her death. And then you'll want to talk about and explore whether or not the character changes. Okay, and what that could potentially mean. So here I've got my statement, which is linked to the author's purpose. I could just start and say Mrs. Burling is presented as a cold and callous woman. But if I'm aiming for a grade 5 or higher, I want to be able to make sure that I'm showing the examiner that I understand why she's presented that way. So what was his main message? And in the evidence, you need to introduce quotations or references in a way that make grammatical sense and show a strong awareness that you know where in the play the quotation has come from. So in your inference, this is where you explore potential interpretations, deeper meanings, and or the author's purpose. And for this, you'll probably want to use words like might and could to open up your exploratory response. And for zooming out, how does the contextual information influence your interpretation and or the play as a whole? So you could zoom out to other parts in the play and connect them. So I could have said here that she's callous because even towards the end she says, you know, I'm not ashamed, although you could develop that later. So it's it's thinking about where you want to put things before you start writing those paragraphs and plan. And you want to talk about the effect. And the effect's always going to be on our head or on our heart. So how do we think and how do we feel about this particular part of the text? Okay, so you want to spend then 5 to 10 minutes planning and 4 to 5 minutes 40 to 45 minutes writing. Try and leave yourself enough time to look over what you've done. If you cross anything out on your exam, by the way, cross it out gently. Don't cross it out so the examiner can't read it. Just make it clear that that's not what you want marked. But you know, the good thing is they will mark it and they will give you points if it's something worthwhile. So let them decide that. And remember, you're marked on your spelling, your punctuation, and your grammar. So things like Priestley should have a capital letter, London should have a capital letter, Brumley should have a capital letter, Eva should have a capital letter. So remember your rules for grammar. Okay, so that is the English Literature Paper 1 exam in a nutshell. Good luck, and may the odds be ever in your favor.